Picture this. You're 14 years old, you're at home with your family, probably thinking about what you're going to have for dinner, and then boom! 3 soldiers show up at your door with an official scroll that's about to change your entire life forever. Your mother collapses, your father can't even look at you, and suddenly you're being dragged away to become the emperor's property. But here's the thing that's going to absolutely blow your mind. Before you could even think about becoming a concubine, you had to pass the most humiliating, dehumanizing test imaginable. And if you failed, well, let's just say some girls never made it out alive. This is the story of the virginity examinations in the Forbidden City. So imagine you're living your normal life as a 14-year-old girl in Imperial China, and the only reason you're even being considered for this horrific process is because you've just started menstruating. That's literally it. The Imperial selection process specifically targeted girls at this exact moment in their lives because they wanted them at what they considered the perfect age for the Emperor's collection. And get this, they didn't want daughters of high-ranking officials who might have too much power or influence. No. They specifically chose daughters of low-ranking officials, girls whose families were desperate to please the imperial court and would never dare to resist or fight back. These families were so terrified of the imperial power that when those 3 soldiers showed up at their door with that scroll, there was absolutely no question about compliance. The moment that scroll was unrolled and read aloud, your entire world would crumble in an instant. Your mother would literally collapse from the shock and horror of what was happening. Your father would submit immediately because he knew that resistance meant death for the entire family. And you had no choice but to comply because you were just a child caught in this massive, brutal machine. The preparation that followed was like something out of a nightmare. They would force you through ritualistic washing, style your hair in ways that marked you as imperial property, and dress you in silk garments that were beautiful on the outside, but represented the death of your freedom on the inside. Then came the journey to the Forbidden City. And guys, this is where things get absolutely horrific. You're talking about days of traveling in complete silence, sleeping on lacquered wood underneath silk that you hadn't earned and didn't deserve, constantly dreaming of home while being awakened by the sound of distant drums that reminded you that you were getting closer and closer to your fate. When you finally arrived at the Forbidden City, the sheer scale of it was designed to be psychologically overwhelming. Those golden roofs, blood-red walls, and heavily guarded entrances weren't just architectural features. They were weapons of intimidation designed to make you feel as small and powerless as possible. But here's where this story takes an even darker turn, because the moment you walked through the gate of heavenly purity with those white jade floors reflecting your trembling hands, you stopped being someone's daughter and became the emperor's property. You were grouped together with other silent, terrified girls, all of you dressed like performers in some twisted show you never auditioned for. And when one girl tried to speak, tried to communicate with the others, a eunuch would raise his hand and immediately silence her, because even the most basic human connection was forbidden. As you were led through those narrowing corridors with dragon carvings that seemed to watch your every move, you could hear the most disturbing sounds coming from adjacent rooms. Sobbing, water splashing, fabric tearing. These weren't random sounds, guys. These were the sounds of other girls going through the same process you were about to experience. And then you'd meet her, the examiner. This old woman dressed in black robes with eyes that looked at you like you were livestock being evaluated for market. When she looked at you and said, "She'll do," it wasn't a compliment. It was a preliminary approval for testing, like you were a product that had passed the first quality inspection. Now this is where things get absolutely brutal. And I want you to understand that what I'm about to describe was the reality for thousands of young girls throughout Imperial Chinese history. The preparation ritual was designed to strip away every single piece of your identity and humanity when they commanded you to undress. And these were commands, not requests. You weren't being asked to participate in something. You were being processed like an object. You'd be thrown into group bathing situations with 4 other girls who were just as terrified as you were. Scrubbed with freezing water by hands that felt like sandpaper, slapped if you moved wrong, and subjected to body modifications that included cutting your nails, removing any lice, and covering your face with pearl powder to lighten your skin. They would dress you in identical pale blue silk robes that didn't fit properly because individuality wasn't the point, uniformity was. And here's something that's going to make your skin crawl. They had a color-coding system for these girls. A red sash meant you were untested, and what that testing involved is something that's going to absolutely shock you. When you looked at your cells, if in those bronze mirrors, after this process, you wouldn't recognize the reflection staring back at you. This wasn't just physical transformation. This was psychological erasure, the systematic removal of your identity, your voice, your connection to home, and your basic humanity. But we haven't even gotten to the worst part yet, because the central question that determined your entire future was whether you were physically untouched. And the way they determined this was through one of the most invasive, humiliating processes imaginable. You would spend hours kneeling on cold stone floors, waiting for your turn to be examined. Girls would be called individually, and here's the thing that's going to absolutely terrify you. Some of them never came back. They had this systematic processing where they would ring a bell, read your name, and you had no choice but to follow them down corridors lined with red silk walls and flickering lanterns that felt like a funeral march. And if you saw a eunuch carrying blood-stained cloth on a tray, you knew exactly what that meant. Someone before you had just been examined, and that blood was supposedly proof of their purity. When your turn came, you'd be led to a black lacquered door into a room that reeked of old wood, incense, and pure fear. The setup was like something designed to maximize your terror. Candlelit space with just a mat, a wooden table, and the examining woman waiting for you. What happened next is something that no 14-year-old girl should ever have to experience. They would force you to lie down on a mat that scratched against your skin, lift your robes without asking for consent, and perform a physical inspection while using clinical terminology that dehumanized you completely. There would be a scribe eunuch documenting everything like you were a piece of inventory. They would press fabric against your bow, dye to check for bleeding because in their twisted logic, blood was proof of purity. But here's what makes this even more horrific. The methodology was completely flawed. The presence or absence of blood doesn't actually prove anything about a person's sexual history, but these examinations were never about medical accuracy. They were about power, control, and the systematic dehumanization of young girls. If you were deemed acceptable and noticed there was no praise or comfort in that verdict, your red sash would be replaced with gold and white to indicate that you had passed. But something was permanently lost during that examination, something that could never be recovered. The girls weren't seen as human beings with feelings, dreams, or futures. They were seen as proof of bloodlines, obedience, and imperial power. And if you think passing this test meant you were safe, think again, because survival without satisfaction was still survival in hell. You might have passed, but you were completely aware that others hadn't, and the knowledge of what happened to them haunted every moment of your existence. So what happened to the girls who failed? This is where the story gets even darker, if you can believe that's possible. There was this unspoken room that girls would whisper about, where those who were classified as impure, ruined, or unfit for service would disappear. The disposal methods were brutal and varied. Some girls would be quietly dismissed back to families who would reject them because they were now considered damaged goods. Others would be reassigned to kitchen or laundry servitude, where they would spend the rest of their lives as invisible servants. But the most terrifying option was complete disappearance without any record that they had ever existed. There are documented cases of girls, like a 16-year-old, who had been confident enough to hide hairpins in her clothing, thinking she could maintain some small piece of her identity. She was eliminated immediately, not because she failed the physical examination, but because she showed signs of independent thinking. Some girls had already been broken by relatives or soldiers during the transport to the Forbidden City, arriving already traumatized and damaged, making their failure inevitable. If you survived and passed, your life in the inner court was its own special kind of hell. The hierarchical structure was designed to create constant tension and competition. At the very top was the Empress, who was the only legal wife the Emperor could have. Below her was the Imperial Noble Consort, then 6 lesser consorts, and at the bottom were the unranked potential concubines, girls like you who had passed the examination but might never actually be chosen by the Emperor. Your physical transformation would continue with new robes, different hairstyles designed to make you more desirable, and makeup application that further erased your natural appearance. You would be trained in behavioral modification, walking like a breeze, proper bowing techniques, speaking in soft tones that wouldn't disturb anyone important. The rule system was so extensive and arbitrary that breaking any single rule could result in punishment or elimination. You couldn't make eye contact with certain people. You had to position yourself in specific ways. You could only eat food in a particular order, and certain colors were absolutely forbidden. Your daily existence would consist of bland food, silk bedding that felt luxurious but couldn't comfort your broken spirit, and constant wondering about whether the emperor would ever summon you. Because here's the reality that most people don't understand about this system. The emperor would see very few of these girls, and sometimes he wouldn't see any of them for months or even years. You were permanently imprisoned in the forbidden city, tied with no possibility of exit except through death or the incredibly rare imperial permission to leave, which almost never happened. Your daily existence would consist of bland food, silk bedding that felt luxurious but couldn't comfort your broken spirit, and constant wondering about whether the emperor would ever summon you. Because here's the reality that most people don't understand about this system. The emperor would see very few of these girls, and sometimes he wouldn't see any of them for months or even years. You were permanently imprisoned in the forbidden city with no possibility of exit except through death, or the incredibly rare imperial permission to leave, which almost never happened. Communication with the outside world was completely forbidden. You couldn't write letters, you couldn't receive news about your family, you couldn't even mention your family's names out loud. You had become a sealed item in a gilded box rather than a person with connections and relationships. The social dynamics among the girls were treacherous because you had to constantly identify who was dangerous, who was ambitious, and who was just crying themselves to sleep every night like you were. There are horror stories about girls who were completely forgotten, like one concubine who died unnoticed and wasn't discovered for 4 years because no one bothered to check on her. And while you were living through this nightmare, new girls were constantly arriving to go through the same brutal process you had survived, creating a perpetual cycle of trauma and dehumanization. But then something would happen that would change everything. The emperor would make his choice. The announcement would come like thunder, sudden and overwhelming, and if you were chosen, the preparation process would begin all over again. But this time, it wasn't about evaluation. It was about polishing. They would cover you in jasmine oils, paint your face paper white, color your lips with vermilion, and place the imperial forehead, at marked you as temporarily special. You would be dressed in gold and crimson silk with hand-embroidered dragons that cost more than most people's houses. The behavioral instructions for meeting the emperor were terrifyingly specific. Silence unless directly addressed, no eye contact under any circumstances, and no emotional display whatsoever. You would be transported at night in a palanquin to the Palace of Mental Cultivation, where the emperor's private quarters waited with jade tiles and phoenix-shaped sconces that cast dancing shadows on the walls. When you were presented to the emperor, you would bow until your nose touched the floor and remain in that position until told otherwise. You would be positioned behind a silk curtain, your silhouette lit by candles for the emperor's viewing pleasure. And here's something that might surprise you. The emperor was often younger than girls expected, with dark eyes that looked at them with complete indifference. You weren't a person to him. You were a temporary diversion. The identity erasure would continue even in his presence, as you would be given a palace name instead of being allowed to use your birth name. Servants would remove your garments while you stood there naked except for pearls and rouge, completely exposed and vulnerable. If the emperor chose to have a conversation, it would be about mundane things like your home province or local flowers. But these weren't genuine questions born from interest. They were tests to see if you were memorable enough to summon again. The physical contact, if any occurred, would be minimal, perhaps a single touch from a cold, dry hand, before an abrupt dismissal with just, "You may go." And just like that, your moment of imperial attention would be over, leaving you to return to your small existence with slightly elevated status. You might get warmer food, newer robes, and more. Attentive guards. But you would also face shifted social dynamics among the other girls. Some would smile at you with fake congratulations. Others would glare with pure hatred. The most dangerous consequence of imperial attention was the political warfare that would immediately target you. Senior consorts would interrogate you over cold tea, and you might find your robes torn in retaliation for temporarily rising above your station. You were no longer invisible, which meant you were newly vulnerable to attacks from those who saw you as a threat to their own positions. 2 years after entering the Forbidden City, something fundamental would have died inside you. You wouldn't scream anymore, you wouldn't cry, and you wouldn't question your fate because emotional numbness was the only way to survive. You would redefine survival itself, not as strength or pride, but as invisible existence without disappearance. You would have learned to become unbreakable by having absolutely nothing left to break. You would remember the girls who didn't make it, like Li Mei, who used to hum while brushing her hair and had a birthmark that looked like a raindrop. You would remember how she gradually stopped speaking and was eventually found dead in the lotus pond. And the most heartbreaking part, there was no mourning allowed, no ceremony, no recognition that she had ever existed. Her name couldn't even be spoken aloud. When the emperor summoned you again, you would smell the wine on his breath and old incense in his clothing as he opened his robe. You would have been so thoroughly trained in compliance that you wouldn't flinch, hesitate, or mentally exist during these encounters. Afterward, you would return to zero worth, dismissed like you had never mattered at all, wondering what exactly you were surviving for. The most devastating realization would come when you looked in a mirror and didn't recognize the face staring back at you. You wouldn't be able to pinpoint the exact moment your original self had died. Was it during the examination, the first forced smile, or while silently witnessing other girls suffering? The palace had stolen your identity piece by piece so gradually that you hadn't noticed until nothing recognizable remained. Even if you were somehow released from the Forbidden City in the future, which was almost impossible, the internal palace would remain with you forever. The psychological damage was permanent and irreversible. Meanwhile, the Forbidden City's machine would continue operating without mourning or memory, processing new girls through the same brutal system while erasing any record of those who didn't survive. This is the historical reality that's usually hidden behind sanitized descriptions of imperial concubinage. These weren't romantic stories of beautiful women living in luxury. These were systematic destruction of children's lives, identity theft on a massive scale, and human trafficking disguised as cultural tradition. The obedient girls were killed slowly rather than quickly, their spirits crushed gradually over years instead of ended mercifully in a single moment. The real history of what these concubines endured rarely leaves the palace walls, and their names are lost to time. But their suffering deserves to be remembered and acknowledged, not romanticized or ignored. This is what actually happened behind the beautiful architecture and golden roofs of the Forbidden City. The systematic dehumanization of thousands of young girls whose only crime was being born female in Imperial China. So the next time someone mentions Imperial Chinese concubines, remember that behind every single one of those women was a story like this one. A story of a young girl whose childhood ended the moment 3 soldiers appeared at her door with an official scroll, whose identity was systematically destroyed through brutal examinations and psychological torture, and whose survival was redefined as simply existing without disappearing. These weren't love stories or tales of luxury. They were horror stories that we need to remember, understand, and never forget.